Dev Diary 12, Teachings from CB2. Hello, prospectors. I am Noise, the lead game designer for the Cycle Frontier. I know that my name is not as fancy as some of our coolest team members looking at you here, Marvelous Breadfish. Dude, Marvelous Breadfish's post was dope, by the way. And that most of you probably never heard of me before is because I'm that good at hiding around Fortuna 3. Now that closed beta 2 has ended, we felt it was important to discuss our teachings from CB2 and draw a picture of the future lying ahead for the cycle from a design perspective. Cool. That's exciting. What was our initial approach? Let's talk a bit about how we approached this beta on the design side. Thanks to Dave's wonderful work, we had a lot of commitments and a very clear creative direction about where we wanted to bring the game. I won't go into details here because that would be way too long, but to keep it short, let's say that we wanted a wondrous feelings of exploration on a completely alien planet, tense uncertainty, unexpected adventure and outcomes, surprising events, and of course, friendship and betrayals made along the way. In that regard, we firmly believe that we achieved all the goals that we set out for ourselves within this given time frame. Agree. Now with CB2 rolling out, many of our hypotheses were put to test. With a combination of business intelligence, community sentiment, and player feedback, we have a much clearer picture of what we want to do next. All of this thanks to you folks. From now on, we will be able to focus on making the game better in every way, starting with the worst offenders and moving from there to smaller topics that we still consider worthy of note. So, what do we plan to do for the release? Right now, we are concentrating our efforts on several crucial points for release. Power progression, weapon balancing, campaign, matchmaking, dungeon, social. I'm surprised they said dungeon. That's exciting. Who's best to speak about these things, if not our experts on those topics? Let me introduce Krill and Rumble. Man, Rumble gets some spotlight. I don't know if this is going to end well. Hello, I am Michel, Michel. I'm gonna take it. I'm gonna take it in the comments on that. AKA Krill, game designer, in charge of our lovely creatures and our deadly weapons, among other things. I'll do my best to walk you through our reasoning for the changes we plan to make regarding our PvP combat. During closed beta 2, we gathered a lot of great feedback from all fronts. Some of them we addressed with our weekly patches, which allowed us to better figure out the impact of our changes almost instantly. Now that the beta has ended, we are taking the time to look at the feedback and the data we received from our different patches in order to evaluate the best course of action for release regarding our PvP. Here are the different topics regarding weapon balancing and power progression that we feel are most important. Power progression. The fact that the power progression curve gives a big advantage to better geared players is a big point of frustration for most of you. Fair. We understand that it doesn't feel good at all to lose all your gear without a chance to be able to fight back, or rather a fighting back that feels pointless. Agreed. We also want the best gear to feel like it's worth the investment to get it and deploy with it at the risk of potentially losing it. Also agree. In short, we are looking to find that sweet spot where you always have a chance to fight back even when facing the best gear, while making sure that deploying with the best gear is worth the risk. Perfect. That's exactly what needs to happen. Our closed beta 2 allowed us to make a few iterations in that regard, adjusting the economy, penetration versus armor curve, and individual weapons. And although none of them were satisfying enough, each iteration moves us closer to that sweet spot. I agree, especially the changes to I want to say it was either pen to helmet. I think it was pen to helmet is a big change that happened during CB2 that really made a big difference towards the end of it and made PvP feel a little bit more viable against better geared players. Based on your feedback and our teaching CB2, here are our intention for release. Please note that although we are confident with these changes, nothing is set in stone, and we will make sure to take future tests and feedback into account for our final changelog. More diminishing returns on pen versus armor formula. The best gear, epic and exotic, will not be as powerful against low tier gear, common, uncommon, rare. Good. I think that's really like the biggest thing, right? Is because this allows the people with the best gear to absolutely pub stomp lobbies. They should be able to compete more easily against AI and against people that also have really good gear, but it shouldn't allow them to absolutely decimate white gear players, right? They should be better, right? They should deal more damage or whatever. But like the instantaneous killing is what has to go, because that feels bad for everybody involved. It doesn't feel rewarding from the player who's using the really good gear, and it certainly doesn't feel good for the player who's getting decimated. The progression in armor and penetration values on shields and weapons now also have diminishing returns. Upgrading from common to uncommon will give more armor and penetration than upgrading from rare to epic. Evens the playing field a little bit. I like this. I think the big question is going to be how easily accessible each tier of armor is based on the crafting systems. These two changes will make it so upgrading to common or rare gear should be really significant, while epic and exotic gear should feel like more of luxury improvements for prospectors that can afford them. They still give you a significant enough advantage in PvP to potentially make a difference, but not so much that you can't be challenged by low-tier gear. Cool. On a parallel topic, during closed beta 2, we reduced the armor value of the higher tier helmets. Yes. Yeah, okay. So it was the actual armor value. The initial intention was to allow players that are skilled enough to land more headshots to be able to take down more easily better geared players. But it also had the side effect to reduce considerably the time to kill in exotic versus exotic situations, for example. When we did the mod, we thought it was a desirable side effect. Having a lower TTK for the best gear adds to the tension and increases the requirement of having good awareness of the surroundings, which are skills that we expect players to develop as they progress the game. But most of the feedback, so before I even read this, my thoughts is that what they created was an environment where the end game PvP, which is exotic versus exotic, was incredibly instantaneous. Whoever hit the most shots the fastest within we're talking like 0.25 second period, would win the fight. And their body would go flying, and now all of a sudden you had a completely new exotic kit in front of you to loot. It felt not rewarding at all. Longer fights in games like this always feel more rewarding. I want, personally, before I read what their intention is, just so that it's clear, my want is that an exotic versus exotic fight should feel and play out like a white gear versus white gear fight. Because let's look at it briefly from a Tark perspective. And I'm not saying that this game has to be Tark, it has to be like Tark, but what we've learned from Tark at the very least is everybody enjoys early wipe the best. The reason they enjoy it the best and they feel like the PvP feels the best in early wipe is not because of the excitement of the new wipe, right? Because let's be honest, they're all content light, right? It's not because of the excitement. You're doing the same shit again. The reason it feels good is because the fights last longer. It's because the fights are drawn out. And when the fights are drawn out, it allows you to make intelligent decisions about how to outplay your opponent. You end up with the ability to think about using utility, think about using the environment to flank, outflank, reposition. You are not instantly killing the opposite player, right? You both have trash gear. It's going to take more than just one shot right off the top. It can take one shot, but odds are it's not going to, right? In an actual encounter. And that's what makes it feel great. You feel immersed in this fight. And when it ends, good or bad, you usually had a pretty fun time, right? I want exotic versus exotic in the cycle to feel the same way, just like the white versus white gear feels, right? It takes time. It takes effort. It should be because they both have purple gear. Now it's an even playing field again, right? And it shouldn't be this instantaneous kill. So now let's read what they have to say. But that is my perspective on the situation. When a fight takes longer, it allows for skill ceiling and skill gap to exist. It allows for different game mechanics to be utilized. It allows the player to feel like they are responsible for their own destiny, right? In that fight. Most of the feedback we got about time to kill and combat in general was that it felt good, although still perfectible around common to rare tiers, while gunfights are over too quickly at high tier. They're definitely over way too quickly. They didn't feel rewarding to win. And that feels bad because that's the last thing that you want for high tier PvP, right? For endgame PvP, which a lot of people are going to be in for a big portion potentially of a season or wipe cycle, it's a problem if that PvP doesn't feel rewarding. It's a huge problem. We decided to revert that change and come back to use similar armor values for helmets and shields in order to have similar time to kill at all power levels. So they need to figure out a way for headshots to be severely rewarded without that symptom, right? It's really important because the skill gap has to exist, but it has to exist in a way that doesn't make these fights instantaneous for really good players. And the thing is, and a big reason why the fights are over so quick is because recoil is non-existent on high-end gear, right? SMGs are still way too powerful. Increasing recoil across the board, especially for SMGs, means way more difficulty at landing consistent shots without some significant mouse skill involved, right? Having to pull down, to pull recoil, to have effective shots at specific ranges is really needed. It's really needed. It would make those fights last longer and provide a skill gap, which is really the overall intent here. So that's my thoughts off the top. Maybe I'll flesh it out more as they continue to talk. Weapon tuning. Here we go. One of the points that came very often when reading the community feedback was that SMGs were too potent. You're damn right. In too many situations. They overshadowed ARs. Yep. Particularly because they had similar effective range, but higher damage input. Correct. Main reason for that was certainly that we didn't have any damage fall off on our weapons. No matter the distance you were shooting your target, the weapon always dealt the same damage. We didn't want to use damage fall off at first to tune the range effectiveness of our weapons for two main reasons. Okay, let's hear it. To allow players that wanted to specialize in a specific weapon to be able to use it in most situations if they learn to master the recoil pattern. That's okay if the recoil exists. As we don't have any damage numbers showing on hit, we wanted to have consistency regarding the damage output of weapons. So if players know what they need 10 shots with a specific weapon to kill someone with gray armor, the amount of shots wouldn't vary much depending on the situation. They can rely on this knowledge. And while I appreciate that, and I think that is important, right? Because one of the biggest issues that games in this genre have is when you see and feel any kind of inconsistency in ballistics, it feels bad, and you feel like power is taken away from you and your ability to outplay your opponent. That's the last thing you want, is to sit there and think, well, I should have gotten the kill and I didn't. I've been dicked, right? That's the last thing you want to feel. And so I understand their hesitancy here. That being said, there are good ways to do this. I think specifically Battlefield has a great model. Let's look at Battlefield 4 for a second. The curves that exist on damage drop off at range provides a much better consistent model so that you know, okay, this is what I'm looking at roughly from this range. From this range, this is what I'm looking at. From this range, this is what I'm looking at, right? Those curves are definitely worth looking at and should potentially be, I feel like they'd be a really good fit for the cycle. A really good fit for like close, medium, long range, right? It never gets to the point where it's not this like linear bullshit where it's like, okay, it does this much damage from here and all the way down here, this is what you're dealing, right? Because that feels really bad. And it also negates the long shot. Like, you want players to feel good about hitting crazy long shots. That's a skill ceiling, right? And it's worth incorporating and making sure it exists in your game. There should be base damages at each range, right? And then drops, right? So I think that those curves would be interesting to look at here. To make it so that different weapons are more effective at different ranges, we then use different tuning parameters, with recoil being in the end the parameter that has the most impact for automatic weapons. It is harder to land shots on target that is far away with weapons that have high recoil value. To that effect, we tuned most MGs to have more recoil than ARs, for example. Beautiful. This is a change that I wanted the entirety of the closed beta. Love seeing that they're going to do it. In the end, it didn't prove to be enough to differentiate the several... Okay, so they're saying that they did this. To that effect, we tuned most SMGs to have more recoil. I never saw this. During the entire closed beta, like from a user input perspective, I thought they were saying they did this after the fact. During the closed beta, I didn't feel this one time. I felt all the way through the very end that ARs had way more recoil and SMGs were super easy to control. I never felt this. So I don't know. In the end, it didn't prove to be enough to differentiate the several types of weapons we have, as we potentially wanted to have SMGs with relatively low recoil like the Flechette that made them compete with ARs too well. So the first and most important change we want to make regarding our weapons is to make their damage fall off with distance. Big. All weapons except snipers will now be less efficient if shot from further away than the intended effective range. I'm curious how they did this. I'm curious if they did it with battlefield type curve or if it's just like a linear reduction. Another related change is to reduce the damage input of all SMGs in order for other weapons to be able to compete with them at the same range. Reduce the damage input of all SMGs. On top of that, we think our recoil reduction... I don't know if this will feel super significant given the rate of fire of a lot of these SMGs, but I'm curious how it will feel, right? On top of that, we think recoil reduction mods were too strong. Agree. And allowed you to compensate too easily for high recoil value of some of our weapons, so we're tuning them down a bit. Good. Good. Finally, we are working on individual changes on weapons in order to make the more options viable based on your feedback by tuning down the weapons that we felt were too strong, such as SMGs, while improving the weapons that underperformed. Yes, the Advocate is getting some love. Great. Excellent. Yeah, everyone and their mother knew that like the gray AR with a pen mod felt better to use than the Advocate, which does not feel good, which should not be the case. So that's big. In conclusion, these improvements should greatly reduce frustration coming from fighting at a disadvantage while allowing for more weapons and different combat styles to shine on the planet. And we are impatiently waiting for you to be able to experience this new combat tuning and to share your thoughts on the matter. I really look forward to this. I mean, this really incorporates the main changes that I put forward to the devs, which were damage drop-off is huge, needed to be incorporated. Increased recoil needed to be incorporated, right? In an effort to specifically nerf SMGs and make them more in line with the rest of the weapons in the game. Love it, right? The overall play here, phenomenal. Exactly what I wanted. So I'm excited to get in there and check it out. Okay. Oh, here's Rumble. Oh, Christ. All right. I guess we got to read what Rumble says. Hi, prospectors. Rumble here. In charge of the activities on Fortuna 3, as well as jobs and missions. Just dropping by to say a few words on the topic of faction campaigns, one of the new features introduced in CB2. Love this. Really felt the game feel more fleshed out. Always felt like there was more to do. Like the campaign stuff on top of the jobs was huge. Really big change from CB1 to 2. Main goals of campaigns were to provide players with sort of red thread to progress along, motivate them to go outside their comfort zone on a regular basis, and of course, also to offer those of you that want it a bunch of nice pieces of story and world building to dig into. Yeah, I do think that like this hits on a lot of different things for people who have different interests in mind when it comes to gaming, which is really nice. It doesn't always have to be like, you know, these are things that exist not just for the super sweaty Slayer, but for people who are trying to immerse themselves into the lore of the game. Good news first, campaigns delivered on those things pretty nicely. Agree. Players in CB2 always had something to progress towards, were forced into new areas, faced bigger and bigger threats, and could dive into a lot of the backstory and motivation of the three factions while unlocking some of the cool stuff along the way. But of course, a feature as huge as faction campaigns with such a massive amount of content is bound to have some flaws when it first goes into player facing. So what do we learn, and what are we going to do about it? Grindiness versus challenge. One common point of criticism that kept coming up in your feedback on the campaigns again and again was the fact that some missions were just too grindy. I received complaints about having to go into the same area again and again, kill creatures there, or searching for the same areas for loot items with low spawn rates again and again, until it became boring or even frustrating instead of a fun challenge to overcome. We wholeheartedly agree with the complaints and have already done multiple tuning passes to make sure that it feels better the next time you get your hands on the game. Bear with us, this stuff is very tricky to get 100% right on the first try, and while we don't yet have a lot of data to look at on the first try, while we don't have a lot of data to look at as a basis for balancing. That's fair. And we saw this happen live throughout CB2. Some things I'll say I think were over-nerfed. That's coming from the perspective, of course, of someone who's playing a lot. But I do think like progression felt very fast. But I think that has to do more with the power creep that exists with the crafting system, more so than the campaign system. I will say that. Unclear hints and guidance. Another unnecessary source of frustration that we heard a lot while hanging out in Twitch streams. I would never complain in my Twitch stream ever about anything. Ever. Was the confusion that came from players not being able or not being sure where to look for certain items or mission locations. My favorite example of this was us asking players to recover meteor reactor notes from the power plant on Crescent Falls before realizing that power plant was the internal name and players only know it as geothermal plant. We of course made sure to correct any discrepancies or unclarities that we were aware of, so please keep the feedback coming on this. Also the hints on the missions. Telling prospectors where to look for certain items were not clear enough about the tiered nature of the loot containers. Mission will now indicate whenever an item can only be found in a certain container type and an area of a specific difficulty or tier. We hope this will make it more straightforward for sure. Yeah, it was definitely difficult. There's like that little gray text in between, like if you're looking at your missions while in a match. Like sometimes you could read like the entirety of like the lore text and still have no idea where to go until you read that little like gray line, right? That was really like the sauce. And once we realized that that was like pretty crucial to understanding what was needed for a mission, we definitely got the hang of it, right? But not everyone realized that for sure. Mission rewards. When going through the feedback that our lovely community team accumulated for us, we realized that that we were being unnecessarily skimpy with the mission rewards. We want faction campaigns to be motivating, worth the player's time, and something that encourages prospectors to keep going to get their hands on more and more cool stuff. Because of this, we've added more items to the mission rewards. Next time you play through the campaign, you'll receive shields, helmets, guns, backpacks, consumables, every now and again, and even key cards for your efforts. I like that. Please let us know how this feels. Missions and jobs asking you to stash certain items have also been tuned to always be worth doing, whatever the investment. That's awesome. That's great news, because sometimes, yeah, it would be like, stash this amount of gear, which significantly outweighed the value of the reward. And that obviously feels bad, and it's a pain in the ass task, right? So that's good to know. Unique missions. Last point does not directly come from criticism or complaints, more like something I've noticed and I thought I would let prospectors know. You all really, really seem to enjoy the unique missions. You know, the ones that send you to recover unique items or send you to unique locations. Agree. Loved it. Like the creature head just randomly sitting on the table. I thought that shit was dope. I think that was made the tasking a lot more immersive. Initially, we intended to sprinkle a few of them in the campaigns in order to make the missions feel less generic and repetitive, but my current thoughts are that they actually enrich the game a lot for players. True. For this reason, we would like to increase the frequency of unique missions in the future campaigns that we will create, as well as even add a few more unique missions to the existing campaign. Awesome. Great. No clear timeline on that yet, but let us know if you agree with this. Agree. For now, if you want to help out, please keep the feedback coming, ideally in our Discord, discord.com/invite/thecycle. And stay tuned. We have awesome stuff planned. Cheers, and see y'all on Fortuna very soon. Rumble. My man. Nicely done, nicely done, nicely done. Thank you, Rumble. Matchmaking and dropping on the planet. This is big. Fingers crossed, no MMR. Fingers crossed, no MMR. Fingers crossed, no MMR. With both our data and community feedback, we are now in a place where we feel like we can make changes to how our matchmaking formulas work. We heard all sides of the equation here, and we believe we can come up with something that will please most of you, if not all. So here's what we plan. We always had the intention of protecting new players. While we did try to do so already, we felt we could have done better on this, so we extended our steps to make sure we protect new players for a bit longer and give them a smoother onboarding experience and entering the real game. In our opinion, onboarding during the CB2 is not smooth enough and should now be way better. We want new players to have time to figure out what the game is about. They might have implemented my thing. How to behave with AI and at least get a better sense of where to look while deploying on Bryce hands. We use our own specific protection method here, which will disappear once we feel we are confident enough that you are able to tackle the dangers of alien planets on your own. It is also worth mentioning that the method will not protect returning players that learned the game, as we felt it would do a disservice to new players joining us later on by doing so. Interesting. Very interesting. So one of my suggestions was like, okay, let's say like, okay, MMR in general, the main reason they have it is not because they want to make the game a competitive game by any stretch of the imagination. It's because they want to protect the new player experience. So why not do that in a different way? Why not allow 10, 20 raids, a specific level of let's call it a specific faction levels, like 3 across the board for all the factions before you get dropped in with people who are already beyond that, right? Like everyone who doesn't have 3 faction level across the board for the very first time is dropped in the same raids with each other so that they can get a true handle on the game before having to go in with the general population. Then you're thrown to the wolves. Figure it out. That would be big, and it would protect the new player experience without having this wild MMR system, which ultimately has a negative impact on most of the other population of the players, right? That's the idea I threw into the ring. We've decided to go with a bucket approach for our matchmaking purposes. What this means for you is that now the player base will be divided into much larger buckets, allowing for more encounters along the way. We're also dividing those buckets in a way that cater to both the technical needs and the needs of our players, keeping smooth experience in mind. At least one of the buckets is dedicated to beginners only, while the other ones are centered around player progression and overall experience. But also, we're taking feedback to help us do some live balancing along the way. We certainly gave it a lot of thought already and figured out ways to make most of you prospectors happy, but we need more tools to fine-tune this experience along the way, and we're aiming to have what we need for that around release. Okay, so still feels like a very much so Band-Aid solution. Expanding the MMR brackets, basically, is what they're calling it buckets. But all they're doing is they're expanding the MMR brackets, and it still disallows me from getting into raid and VoIPing with newer players. That feels bad. From a random experience perspective, a lot of people love Sherping. Always been the case. Some people really enjoy helping new people, helping them figure shit out. Even, you can still do this beyond that, like, protective bubble or bucket, whatever you want to call it. But I will never be in that bucket. And a lot of people who are going to be really proficient at the game will never be in that bucket. And if I'm only in the best bucket, it still feels bad. It's still narrowing my experience by only putting me in, like, even if, let's say the buckets were beginners, not hitting level 3 across the board with the factions. Let's just call it that. That's the beginner bucket, right? I'll never be in that bucket. It is what it is. I think that it's important to let those people figure the game out without having to deal with me at all. That's fine. I understand that. But then you have, let's say there's only 2 other buckets. Let's just say there's only 2 other buckets. There's the bottom half bucket of people who are in the full population. There's the top half bucket. Missing out on half the population narrows the shit out of my player experience. This game is not all about just being hostile. It 100% narrows. Only being in that top half bucket is still going to suck ass. It's still going to suck ass. Doesn't matter how big the buckets are. I'm not suggesting that they're fucking huge. Right? It's still going to be bad. I'm still going to be in the sweaty bucket. That bucket's filled to the brim with sweat. Overflowing, in fact. And I think only allowing me to be in that bucket feels terrible. Because I'm not, like, there's a huge portion of players that, like, people in this genre are not playing it to be competitive for the most part. Like, that's a tiny slice, right? And it's good to have those guys as villains. It's something that I learned a long time ago in DayZ Standalone. You have to have the people who are going to be villains and always, always, always want to shoot you in the face. It's great to have a small portion of the population that are going to behave like that. I truly think that it is not the vast majority of like the latter bucket that is going to feel that way. Because the more you play this game, the more proficient you get, the more you realize that if you always play that way, it doesn't feel good. It's not rewarding. It doesn't feel good at all. It's not what the game is about, right? The more you play and the better you get, the more you realize that, right? But the only way to maintain that thought process is by being able to interact with people who aren't in your bucket. And if you can't do that, that is inherently turning that tiny sliver of people who would just only try to be slayers into everybody. And that's like the exact opposite of what they want with these buckets. They're causing their own issue, right? And that's frustrating. And I think anytime you narrow the scope in a game like this, it feels bad and will continue to feel bad. So I'm against the buckets. I feel very strongly about it, in case you couldn't tell. And I've just played a lot of open world, high risk, high reward, void first, experience forward experiences throughout the years to come to this conclusion. And I think that these buckets are a big disservice towards that overall experience for players, especially from the perspective of longevity for the game. The more you narrow the scope of experience for these players, the more repetitive the game becomes, the less long they're going to want to play every season. That's just my 2 cents. Dungeons. I'm excited they even mentioned dungeons. I didn't think we were going to get into it. We are also going live with our first dungeon. Very hype. To explore it, I knew it was going to be Osiris. I knew it was going to be the Orbital Cannon Beacon. We talked about this a lot during CB2. We definitely put the pieces together as far as like the lore was concerned. And we know where it's going to be. And that's hype. Very exciting. This is going to open up Crescent Falls a ton. Because I'm not going to spoil the quest line. No spoilies. But we know that this is going to exist in a place that is not currently a hotspot on Crescent Falls. And as a result, you actually have to move around the map instead of just existing at the warehouse and the northeast corner of the map, right? So that's hype. That's all I'm going to say. It expands the map significantly, right? You're no longer just jerking it in the warehouse and the labs, which is hype. So I'm excited for this. Very excited for this. Expect to find darkness, difficulty, and rewards for your trouble, but be wary of whoever could enter behind you. Love it. Love it. Collaborative PvE with a PvP element. Love it. On this front, we have good news. We're bringing back the multiplayer station, Pog. This was big. People were very upset that they were alone in their station. Next time we'll meet there, you'll be able to witness the splendor of our new goods and customization options for all prospectors. Also, Pog. There are some fantastic eye candies waiting for you right at the corner, so you can finally backstab unwary prospectors while dripping with style. Of course, as for many of the other topics, there are several other things that we're going to work on in that regard, but we're not ready to comment on any of them yet. And that's it for now, at least. Try and find us on Fortuna 3 if you can. It won't be that hard to find me. I'll be the player in the fanciest suit. Who knows? Maybe you will learn some secret cool stuff about the game while teaming up with one of us. Also, I definitely won't shoot you in the back as soon as the evac ship lands. I promise. See you all sooner than you think. Exciting. Can't wait. Looking forward to it. Big thanks for the update. Excited about most of it. Excited about most of it. Stoked to play the game again. Bring it back, boys. Bring it back. Let me know what you are most excited about down below in the comments. And also include what you are least excited about. Let me hear it.